In our efforts to understand worldviews and gain cultural fluency, we've looked at the first way, the missiological approach, which you'll find linked up here. In today's video, we will look at another way to understand culture, the anthropological approach. Anthropological. Anthropology is defined as the study of humanity, human behavior, human biology, and societies in the past and present. More specifically, in this video, we will briefly look at 5 aspects of anthropology that will help us to learn about another culture. The first aspect is cultural immersion. Whereas the missiological approach allows us to get our feet wet, so to speak, the anthropological approach allows us to then go from the shallow end of the pool to the deeper end of the pool. As I said in the previous video, that the missiological approach is the easiest quote-unquote way to understand cultures. The 3 paradigms, honor, shame, innocence, guilt, and power, fear worldviews give us something to work with to decode behaviors, reactions, and rationale for doing things. It's one of the most useful tools to have in short-term trips. The anthropological approach then allows us to really be immersed in a culture, to seek first to understand before seeking our message to be understood. This is one of the most useful tools to have for a 1-year internship or a 2-year apprenticeship or for long-term overseas cross-cultural work. One of the primary tenets of anthropology is cultural immersion. For at least a year, you won't be able to understand someone's culture if you're not spending at least a year living in that culture, learning their language, eating their foods, participating in their cultural traditions, observing the culture, and most of all, learning to love the people and the culture as they are. Mission agencies should have programs and professionals that will teach basic anthropological principles before people are sent off for local or overseas cross-cultural work. And those who go overseas should have at least some anthropological bent, or at least a learner's attitude. The second aspect is cultural relativism. One of the most important contributions of the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas in the late 1800s is this principle of cultural relativism. It has become one of the bedrock principles for modern anthropology, kind of like a prime directive if you're speaking Star Trek. Cultural relativism is to understand a group of people based on their own history, their own values, their own traditions, and not to be judged against the criteria of another culture. The opposite of cultural relativism is ethnocentrism, where a group's culture is considered to be the gold standard and other cultures are ranked upon the values and practices of that gold standard. One anthropologist notes that previously, during the age of European expansion, the explorers didn't study other people groups to understand the diversity of human cultures, but to rank other cultures in relation to their ethnicity. They would ask, are these humans as human as I am, or are they somehow less human? If you can rank someone as subhuman or less human than you, then it provides the rationale to treat them with less respect and value. And it has paved the way to many atrocities, including atrocities perpetrated by quote-unquote Christians in the past. Things like genocide, slavery, large-scale disenfranchisement, racism, and exploitation of those people groups' natural resources. Boas introduced the idea of cultural relativism, which holds that cultures cannot be objectively ranked as higher or lower, or better or more correct, but that all humans see the world through the lens of their own culture, and so they need to be judged according to their own culturally acquired norms. For Boas, the object of anthropology is to understand the way in which culture-conditioned people understand and interact with the world in different ways, and to do this, it was necessary to gain an understanding of the language and the cultural practices of the people studied. This principle is super important for a cross-cultural mission Because if, for example, you begin with the mindset that those people group over there are lost, you have already, first of all, created an us versus them division. But more significantly, you have just ranked yourself, because you know Jesus, as already above them in some way or another. Instead, we should be asking, how do I introduce this Jesus whom I came to know and follow within my culture to another culture? How do I bring access to Jesus in places where God has called me? How can I walk alongside a person from another culture so that we can understand and obey Jesus together? It's a subtle difference that can make a significant impact. No one's going to understand what you're communicating until you understand how to communicate with them. The third aspect is critical realism. This technically came from philosophy in the realm of epistemology, or the study of truth and knowledge, but it has had significant impact in the social sciences and theology. Critical realism states that there is an objective reality out there, and there is an observer right here trying to perceive that objective reality. But the observer is limited, subjective, and dependent upon their background. So what they perceive is filtered through these worldviews, and it is the representation of it that is what is real for the observer. So if the observer wants to get a closer approximation to that objective reality, they would need to somehow dialogue with it, meaning they would test their observations using different filters and methods. This would allow for a better approximation of that objective reality, and through recursive iterations of observation, testing, verification, and new knowledge, then the observer would get closer to understanding the thing they want to understand. You see, critical realism is the middle of the road response to positivism, which states that there is a direct correlation between the observer and the reality being observed, and instrumentalism, which states that our observations are completely subjective, but we can use that for what we need it for. So what this means is that there's likely more to what we observe because we're looking at things through our own cultural worldview and filters. But it also means that our observations are not completely worthless. So in another way of saying it, what we observe is only provisional data to the reality that we're trying to understand. Paul Hebert, a Christian anthropologist, suggests that just as the scientific research is dependent upon the scientific community to verify, debunk, or sharpen scientific hypotheses, then there also needs to be a hermeneutical community that can work together to make better sense of the objective reality. Here's a quick example. When we were in Guinea, West Africa, it is known that polygyny is a common practice. That means that men can marry up to 4 wives, as permitted in the Quran. When you first observe that, you can make several value judgments saying that it's wrong, it's impractical, and complicated, or things to that effect. However, when you start asking why do they do that, you start to get a broader and more complex picture that's not so easily untangled. You find out that having lots of kids is a high value, partly because of high mortality rates. Their babies don't survive. Partly because girls can help out with chores and boys can help out in the fields. Partly because marrying out girls gains dowry for the family. And so one way to get more kids is to marry more women. Then you also find out that marrying between families strengthens tribal lines and relations. Sometimes by marrying someone from another family or another tribe increases the honor and the status of the woman's family, of their status among the larger community. Marrying also gives the woman social and economic security. This is especially important when a married woman, for example, becomes a widow, and her late husband's brother marries her so that she and her children will be cared for. But then on the flip side, you also discover that the relationships between the co-wives are more often strained than friendly. There is often jealousy and infighting between the wives because the men generally first marry for children and for independence from their family. Then they marry the second or third for more children and for love. And then, much later, when the patriarch dies, there's often fighting over the inheritance. So the simple observation of men marrying multiple wives leads to the more complex dynamic of polygamous societies. But we can't get there unless we reserve judgment and continue probing and dialoguing with insiders and outsiders of the culture. And more importantly, as we continue asking insiders questions and allowing them to make the changes that perhaps God is asking them to change, and thinking through the implications of these changes in their culture. The fourth aspect is cultural anthropology. It is commonly known that anthropology has been traditionally subdivided into 4 fields: archaeology, the study of dead societies; physical or biological anthropology, which is the study of physical variations of humans around the world; linguistic anthropology; and sociocultural anthropology. While the first 2 are super interesting as well, we'll only look at the latter 2. Cultural anthropology is the study of modern-day human societies by looking at how human cultures exist in the world today, what impacts them, what traditions they have, and how current global trends affect that culture. The example I gave of the existence of polygyny in West Africa is an example of cultural anthropology. We could also look at the impact of technology in economically poor communities. When my wife and I moved to Guinea, West Africa, we were surprised by how almost everyone owned a cell phone. We later discovered that maintaining a social network is of high value. In a previous video, which I've linked up here, we alluded to how we would often receive phone calls from our African friends that would last about a minute. You see, even though you can get a phone plan, it's cheaper to buy credit by the minute. So the minute is the cheapest possible denomination, hence the minute-long phone calls. Now, while the minute phone calls are mostly spent on greetings and pleasantries, they made their social call and have maintained their social network. But why do they do this? From what we've gathered, it's partly because they saw us as people of means and resources, and partly because calling was a way to honor us in our friendship. But they do this all the time in their own culture and among each other. The fifth aspect is linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology studies language in its context. You can study language from a textbook or from classes, but you're only studying the generalized version of the language. When you study language in context, you not only study the language people speak, but also how they speak them and how the language varies from place to place. Linguistic anthropology is fundamental to cross-cultural communication because we first need to understand that language is this extremely complex system of symbols that are used to represent concepts. And these symbols obey rules that have been agreed upon by that community. So in order to communicate the gospel, which means good news, we need to enter into the nuances of the language. What we understand is not just the words we say, it's how we say them. It's the context in which we say them, and it's about who says them. We cannot effectively communicate good news until we understand what good news means for another culture, and until we understand the symbols that can be used to communicate the good news that Jesus is King effectively to another culture. So let's summarize what we've learned from this video. The missiological approach is for short-term, first-pass observations that can help us to start understanding another culture. The anthropological approach is useful for longer-term, deeper dive into the culture. And we briefly talked about 5 aspects of the discipline to help us become better cross-cultural learners. Cultural immersion is important to have more time to spend in and among a people group to get to know them better. Cultural relativism is important because it reminds us to try to understand a culture on its own terms and not from our own cultural biases. Cultural realism is important to remind us that we will perceive other cultures from our own worldview lens first, but we can still make provisional observations that can be refined with and through a community. Cultural anthropology probes the day-to-day observable behavior of people and to try to continue refining our understanding of why they do what they do. And finally, linguistic anthropology looks at the complexity and nuances of language. In the next videos, we'll look at some examples from the Bible and from real-life experiences with other cultures. And we'll look at them using a combination of these 5 aspects of anthropology. So until next time, stay safe and remain resilient. Shalom v'chesed ve'emet, my friends.